The largest part of savings deposited in banks is lent out to enterprises in the economy, and another large part to the state. The debtor pays interest to the bank, and after deduction of the bank margin, it credits these interests on the savings account of the creditor. However, the interest revenues of the creditor come from some debtors who have to earn these interests. Every entrepreneur calculates the prices for his products on the basis of all of his costs for staff, raw material, maintenance of machines, rent for ground and buildings and so on, and the costs of borrowed capital. The entrepreneur has to collect the amount of his costs through the price for his produce. In the end, it is the consumer who has to pay for all these costs. And the vast majority of consumers have to work for it, and thus they also work for the servicing of debts that are not their own. Hence, the assumption that we are only paying interest for our own loans is a misconception. Everyone pays an interest share of about 40 to 45% with every spent euro. On the other hand, most people receive interest returns through their own savings. The distribution of interest payments depends on expenditures. The revenues from the interest pool, from where the money flows back, depend on the fortune that one possesses, and they concentrate on a minority. The question arises now, who is winner and who is loser in this game of interest redistribution? Because dividing macroeconomic figures by the number of households gives an average idea only, which may be far away from individual experience. In order to get a more differentiated picture, the number of total households was divided into 10 groups of 3.8 million households each. Group 1 comprises the poorest households with the lowest income and no or very little property, and Group 10 encompasses the richest households. The green columns show the expenditures for consumption that the members of the various groups can afford from their available income. The orange columns represent the interest share with an estimated proportion in prices of 40% in this graph. The blue columns finally represent the interest returns in the various groups of households. Drawing the balance between interest payments and interest returns shows that the first 8 groups have a negative balance. They pay more than they get back. In the 9th group, payments and returns are almost even. They are neither losers nor are they winners in the game. The big winners are found in the 10th group, where the losses of the first 8 groups turn into profits. The surplus in this group, the balance of interest payments and revenues, corresponds to the losses of the majority of the population. Or expressed in concrete terms, there is a continuous net flow of interest payments from the majority of the population to a small minority, which already possesses a large fortune. These mechanisms of interest redistribution constitute a veritable vicious circle. Expansion of credits to the economy leads to higher interest reflux on top of monetary assets, which again necessitates further expansion of credits and indebtedness. Cyberneticians call this a circuitry with positive feedback. Such a circuitry accelerates itself. It is self-destructive and can only collapse in the end. And such is the basic construction of our monetary system. Now, this is an interesting graph which tells us something about the public awareness of the problems in the sphere of money. Every now and then, these two topics had dominated the mainstream media, the price of mineral oil and the costs for healthcare. Of course, for an economy that so much depends on mineral oil as ours and on healthy workers, these are certainly important items. Some may still remember the oil price shock at the end of the 70s. Since that time, every rise in oil prices was sensitively registered by the public opinion with great excitement. And the cost explosion for healthcare, which was noticed at the beginning of the 90s, has become a never-ending story in the media. Of course, a tenfold increase of health costs is a tough nut to crack. Compared to the excitement caused by these costs for the economy, It is surprising that the third development of costs, the capital costs or interest payments, had hardly ever become a topic in media. They never aroused public excitement, although one could imagine that the economy creaks under a burden that is more than twice as high as costs for healthcare and oil price together. No? All right, it's a taboo. Let's wipe it off. The Swiss professor Hans-Christoph Binswanger is one of the very few economists who recognized the connection between environmental degradation and the monetary system. And he said, 99% of people don't see the money problem. Science doesn't see it, economic theory doesn't see it, and the latter even defines it as non-existent. As long as we don't see money management as a problem, there is no prospect for an ecological transformation of our society. Let's turn to the question of how unemployment is affected by interest burdens. Here is the curve of interest revenues and their various ascending phases. The yellow curve represents them in absolute figures. The red line reflects their ratio to the gross domestic product, the economic output. Since the growth of the economic performance slows down with increasing interest charges, their proportion shoots up and they rapidly decline when interest rates decrease. The proportion of interest charges shows the scope of the economy. We also observe that the proportion of interest charges go on to increase after a short decline. This is the consequence of the fact that the advantage of increasing interest returns will be swallowed by excessively rising debts. While this advantage had a positive effect during the first decade after the war, which even contributed to a gradual elimination of unemployment, this is not so anymore. Today, unemployment increases and could only be reduced for short periods by cuts in wages. The cake can be divided only once, and if the monetary capital and with it the burden of debt interests grows faster than the economic output, then the other side will receive a corresponding smaller share. The state, which was able to finance the social net and support the unemployed, is increasingly incapable of doing so. For one thing, because its revenues drop when companies go bankrupt or have lower turnovers. On the other hand, because the increasing number of unemployed and growing social tensions cause higher costs. These costs are not bearable any longer, and an attempt has to be made to reduce these costs, because they're nagging on the reserves. A comparison of various developments in the economy between 1991 and 2001 may give an idea about the dilemma.